My wife started accidentally ruining my things after I criticized her cooking once. I told Olivia the chicken was dry exactly once, and within 2 weeks, she'd destroyed $400 worth of my stuff. Not all at once, and never obviously on purpose, which is what made it so maddening. The first incident happened 3 days after the chicken comment. I'd come home from the office and found my favorite leather jacket crumpled in the washing machine, soaking wet with all her red towels. The dye had bled everywhere, turning the brown leather this mottled pink and rust color that looked like a disease. Olivia stood in the laundry room doorway with her hand over her mouth, eyes wide, saying she'd grabbed it thinking it was the bathroom rug. I stared at her because my jacket looked nothing like our bathroom rug, but she seemed genuinely horrified. She kept apologizing and saying she'd been distracted by a work email. I told her it was fine, even though the jacket had cost $300 and I'd had it for 5 years. She offered to pay for a new one, but I said we'd just take it out of our joint account anyway, so what was the point? The second incident happened 5 days later, when I was getting ready for my morning run. I opened my gym bag and found my running shoes filled with bleach. Not spilled on them, but actually filled, like someone had poured bleach directly into each shoe until it pooled in the toe box. The fabric was disintegrating, and the rubber sole had started to bubble. The smell burned my nostrils when I lifted them out. Olivia was in the kitchen making coffee, and I walked in holding the shoes at arm's length. She turned around and her face went pale. She said she'd been cleaning the bathroom the night before and must have set the bleach bottle in my gym bag while she answered a phone call. She said she'd completely forgotten about it and knocked it over when she zipped the bag closed. I asked her why she'd put bleach in my gym bag in the first place, and she said she didn't know. She'd been stressed about a deadline at work. I threw the shoes in the trash and ordered new ones online while Olivia kept apologizing. That night she made my favorite dinner, pot roast with potatoes, and everything was perfectly cooked. I didn't mention it. The third incident happened a week after that when I needed to print out some contracts for a client meeting. I went to my home office and turned on my printer, which made this horrible grinding sound before spitting out a page covered in ink smears. I opened the paper tray and found every single sheet soaking wet, completely unusable. The paper had turned to mush, and some of it had gotten into the printer mechanisms. Olivia came upstairs when she heard me cursing and looked at the destroyed printer. She said she'd spilled her water glass near my desk that morning and must have knocked the water into the paper tray when she was cleaning it up. I asked her why she didn't mention it, and she said it seemed like such a small spill that she didn't think it would cause any damage. The printer was ruined, and I had to drive to the office supply store to print my contracts at their print center. I spent 45 minutes there and barely made it to my meeting on time. When I got home that evening, Olivia had already ordered a new printer with 2-day shipping and paid for it with her own credit card. She apologized again and said she'd be more careful. I started noticing a pattern around the fourth incident, which happened 2 weeks later when I went to get dressed for a friend's wedding. My suit was hanging in the closet where I'd left it after getting it dry cleaned, but when I took it out, I found 3-inch scissors cuts running down both legs of the pants. Clean cuts, straight lines, like someone had deliberately sliced the fabric. My heart started pounding because there was no way that was an accident. I found Olivia in the bathroom doing her makeup and held up the ruined pants. She looked at them and gasped, dropping her mascara wand into the sink. She said she'd been hemming a dress the day before and must have left the scissors on the bed, and when she tossed my suit pants on the bed to make room in the closet, the scissors must have gotten caught in the fabric. I asked her how scissors could make 3 separate cuts in different places, and she started crying. She said she didn't know. Maybe the scissors bounced or something, but it was completely accidental. I stood there watching her cry and felt like the bad guy for suggesting she'd done it on purpose. I ended up wearing a different suit to the wedding and didn't bring it up again. My friend Greg noticed something was wrong when we met for drinks after the wedding reception. I told him about the jacket, the shoes, the printer, and the suit pants. Greg listened, and then asked very carefully if I thought Olivia was doing it on purpose. I said no, because she seemed genuinely upset every time, and accidents happen. Greg leaned back in his chair and said, 4 accidents in a month was a lot of accidents, especially when they all happened to my stuff and nothing of hers. I told him Olivia was just stressed about work and being careless. Greg asked if I'd done anything to piss her off, and I said no, everything had been fine. He gave me this look that said he didn't believe me, but he dropped it, and we talked about something else. I drove home thinking about what he said, and trying to remember if I'd done anything wrong. The chicken comment came back to me, but that was one small critique about one meal, and Olivia wasn't the type to hold grudges over something that minor. The fifth incident happened 3 days after my conversation with Greg. I had an important presentation scheduled with a major client, and I'd spent 2 weeks preparing a physical portfolio with printed samples of our firm's best architectural designs. The portfolio was in a leather binder that cost $200 and contained 40 pages of carefully arranged photos and floor plans. I left it on the dining room table the night before my presentation because I wanted to review it one more time in the morning. When I came downstairs the next day, I found the binder sitting in a puddle of orange juice. The liquid had soaked through the leather and destroyed every single page inside. The photos were ruined, the floor plans were illegible, and the binder itself was warped and stained. Olivia was standing at the counter pouring coffee, and I asked her what happened. She turned around and covered her mouth with her hand. She said she'd made orange juice that morning and must have set the pitcher down too close to my binder. She said the pitcher was sweating and probably created condensation that spilled over. I pointed out that the binder was sitting in at least a cup of liquid, and she said the pitcher must have tipped over. I asked why she didn't clean it up or tell me, and she said she'd only poured the juice 5 minutes ago and was about to drink it when I came downstairs. I had to call my client and postpone the presentation by 3 hours while I rushed to the office and reprinted everything. My boss Richard saw me frantically using the printer and asked what was going on. I explained about the orange juice and he frowned. He said this was the second time in a month I'd had to reschedule something because of problems at home, and clients didn't like unreliability. I felt my face get hot because he was right. I'd rescheduled the first meeting because of the printer incident. Richard told me to get my home life sorted out because it was affecting my work. I spent the rest of the day feeling humiliated and angry. When I got home that evening, Olivia had made another elaborate apology dinner with steak and garlic bread. She said she felt terrible about the presentation and offered to help me organize my materials better so nothing like that would happen again. I told her I'd just keep my work stuff at the office from now on. She got quiet, and we ate dinner in silence. The 6th incident happened a week later when I went to my car to drive to work. I pressed the unlock button on my key fob, and nothing happened. I tried again, and the car stayed locked. I looked through the window and saw water all over the interior, pooling in the seats and the cup holders. I ran back inside and asked Olivia if she knew why my car was full of water. She came outside with me and stared at the car with this confused expression. She said she'd washed both cars the day before, and maybe she'd left my window cracked open and gotten water inside with the hose. I pointed out that all 4 windows were completely closed, and she'd have to have opened the door to get that much water inside. Olivia said maybe she did open the door to clean the interior and forgot to close the window after, and then used the hose nearby. Her explanation made no sense, but she seemed so genuinely puzzled that I didn't know what to say. I had to call a detailing service to come pump out the water and dry the interior. The whole process took 5 hours and cost $300. I missed an entire day of work, and Richard sent me a terse email asking if everything was okay at home. I started documenting everything after that. I kept a note on my phone with dates, times, and descriptions of each incident: the jacket, the shoes, the printer, the suit pants, the portfolio binder, the car interior. 6 major incidents in 6 weeks, all affecting my belongings, all explained away as accidents. I also started noticing smaller things that I'd previously dismissed. My phone charger would be unplugged in the morning even though I'd left it plugged in at night. My coffee would taste off, like she'd used expired milk or not enough coffee grounds. My lunch would be missing from the fridge even though I'd packed it the night before. These were tiny things, easy to explain away individually, but when I looked at them all together, they formed a pattern. I didn't say anything to Olivia because I still wasn't sure if I was being paranoid. Part of me thought maybe she was genuinely just having a clumsy phase, but another part of me, the part that listened to Greg's skepticism, wondered if something else was going on. The 7th incident confirmed my suspicions. I had a big project review coming up, and I'd been working on a physical model of a building design for 3 weeks. The model was made of foam core and balsa wood and took up half my home office desk. It represented hundreds of hours of careful cutting and gluing and painting. I'd been taking photos of my progress and posting them on my professional social media because other architects liked seeing the process. The morning of my review, I went to my office to carefully pack the model in its protective box. The office door was closed, which was unusual because I always left it open. I pushed it open and found the model on the floor in pieces. It looked like someone had swept it off the desk. The delicate balsa wood walls were snapped, the foam core base was crushed, and 3 weeks of work was completely destroyed. I stood there unable to move or breathe. Olivia appeared behind me and let out this shocked gasp. She said she'd been vacuuming earlier and must have bumped the desk with the vacuum and knocked it off. I turned to look at her and asked how a vacuum could knock something off a desk that was 3 feet away from any wall. She said she'd been vacuuming the desk itself to get dust off. I asked why she'd vacuum my work desk when she knew I was in the middle of a major project. Olivia's face crumpled, and she said she was trying to help, and she'd been so careful, but the vacuum cord must have caught on something. I picked up the pieces of my model and threw them directly in the trash. There was no saving any of it, and I didn't have time to rebuild. I had to go to my review and explain to the senior partners that I couldn't show them the physical model because of an accident at home. They were understanding but clearly disappointed, and I could tell it reflected poorly on my preparation. Richard pulled me aside after the meeting and asked if I was having personal problems. I told him everything was fine, and he said it didn't seem fine based on how many work issues I'd been having lately. He suggested I take some personal time to sort things out. I felt my career starting to slip through my fingers because of these incidents, and I couldn't even prove they weren't accidents. When I got home, Olivia tried to apologize again, but I told her I didn't want to hear it. I went to my office and closed the door and sat there staring at the empty desk where my model had been. That night I barely slept, running through every incident in my mind and trying to figure out what was happening. The next morning I called Greg and asked if I could come over. We sat in his backyard and I told him about the model and showed him my phone notes documenting all the incidents. Greg read through everything carefully and then looked at me. He said I needed to confront Olivia directly because this was beyond normal clumsiness. I told him I didn't know how to bring it up without sounding crazy or accusatory. Greg said I should show her the list and ask for an explanation, and her reaction would tell me everything I needed to know. He said if she got defensive or angry, that was a red flag, but if she seemed genuinely concerned and wanted to figure out what was going on, maybe there was a reasonable explanation. I drove home feeling like I was preparing for a confrontation that would either solve everything or destroy my marriage. Olivia was in the kitchen when I got home, cooking dinner, and I walked in and set my phone on the counter showing my notes. I told her I needed to talk about something important. She looked at the phone screen and her expression changed from curious to guarded. She asked what this was, and I said it was a record of everything that had been happening. Olivia picked up my phone and read through the notes. Her face went through several expressions: confusion, hurt, and then something I couldn't identify. She set the phone down and asked if I seriously thought she was destroying my things on purpose. I said I didn't know what to think, but 7 major incidents in 2 months was more than coincidence. Olivia's voice got cold, and she said accidents happen, and I was being paranoid. I asked her to explain how each accident happened in a way that made sense, and she said she already had, multiple times, and I was choosing not to believe her. I pointed out that my work was suffering because of these incidents, and she snapped that maybe if I wasn't so obsessed with work, I'd be around to prevent accidents from happening. That comment hit me wrong because I worked normal hours and was home every evening. I asked what she meant, and Olivia said I was always focused on my projects and my career and never paid attention to anything else. I felt my anger rising, and I said that was completely unfair. I helped around the house and spent time with her and didn't deserve to have my things destroyed. Olivia laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. She said I wanted to talk about what people deserved, and we could definitely have that conversation. I stood there waiting for her to explain, and Olivia crossed her arms and leaned against the counter. She said the chicken comment wasn't an isolated critique. It was the latest in a year of constant small criticisms about everything she did. I felt my stomach drop because I had no idea what she was talking about. She started listing things, and each one felt like a punch. I'd commented that her coffee was too weak. I'd suggested she could use more seasoning in her pasta. I'd mentioned her car could use a wash. I'd asked if she was going to wear that outfit to dinner with my boss. I'd pointed out a typo in an email she'd sent me. I'd said her sister talked too much during movies. I'd criticized how she loaded the dishwasher. I'd told her she was being too sensitive when she got upset about a joke I made. Every single item she listed was something I vaguely remembered saying, but I'd thought they were helpful observations or small comments that didn't matter. Olivia said they mattered to her, and after a year of feeling criticized constantly, the chicken comment was the moment she realized I didn't actually respect anything she did. I tried to defend myself by saying those were just minor things, and she was blowing them out of proportion. Olivia's eyes filled with tears, and she said that's exactly the problem. I thought criticizing her constantly was minor. She said I made her feel incompetent and inadequate in her own home. I felt defensive and said I was trying to be helpful, and if she couldn't handle feedback, that was her problem. Olivia actually flinched when I said that, and she asked if I genuinely believed what I was saying. I said yes, because being in a relationship meant being honest with each other. She laughed again, that same bitter sound, and said honesty was different from constant criticism disguised as help. I told her she was being overly emotional and making me sound like a villain when all I'd done was make a few observations. Olivia stared at me for a long moment, and then said she wasn't destroying my things on purpose, but maybe she was being subconsciously careless because she was tired of walking on eggshells around someone who never thought anything she did was good enough. She said she'd been in therapy for 3 months trying to figure out why she felt so anxious and depressed at home, and her therapist had helped her realize she was living with someone who undermined her constantly. I felt like the ground was shifting under my feet because I'd had no idea she was in therapy. I asked when she'd started and why she hadn't told me. Olivia said she'd told me multiple times that she had appointments on Wednesday afternoons, but I'd never asked what kind of appointments. She said I'd been so wrapped up in my own work and projects that I hadn't noticed she was struggling. I tried to remember her mentioning appointments and realized she was right. She'd said something about Wednesday afternoons, and I'd just nodded without asking for details. I felt a spike of guilt, but pushed it down and said none of that excused destroying my things. Olivia said she wasn't making excuses. She was explaining that maybe her subconscious was acting out because her conscious mind couldn't figure out how to communicate with someone who dismissed her feelings. I told her that sounded like therapy speak and not like taking responsibility. Her face went flat and emotionless, and she said, if I thought she was destroying my things on purpose, maybe I should record her and catch her in the act. Then she walked out of the kitchen, and I heard our bedroom door close. I spent that night on the couch thinking about everything she'd said. I pulled up my notes and read through them again, but this time I tried to remember what had happened before each incident. The jacket got ruined 3 days after the chicken comment. The shoes got ruined after I'd told her she was too sensitive about a joke. The printer got destroyed after I'd criticized how she loaded the dishwasher. The suit pants were cut after I'd made a comment about her sister. The portfolio was ruined after I'd mentioned her car needed washing. The car interior was flooded after I'd pointed out a typo in her email. The model was destroyed after I'd suggested she could use more seasoning in her pasta sauce the week before. Each incident followed a criticism, and I started to see what she was talking about. I thought I was being helpful, but from her perspective, I was constantly telling her she wasn't doing things right. I still didn't think that justified destroying my stuff, but I could see how it might make someone careless or resentful enough to not care if accidents happened. The next morning I tried to talk to Olivia, but she said she didn't want to discuss it anymore. She said she was going to stay with her sister Claire for a few days because she needed space. I asked her not to leave, and she said she needed time to think about whether she could stay in a marriage where her husband thought she was sabotaging him. She packed a bag and left while I stood in the doorway watching. The house felt empty without her, and I spent the day trying to work from home but mostly just staring at my computer screen. I kept thinking about the criticisms she'd listed and trying to remember each one in context. Some of them I genuinely couldn't recall saying, but others came back to me with uncomfortable clarity. The coffee comment had been made when I was running late for work and said something about needing stronger coffee to wake up. The outfit comment had been phrased as a question, but had clearly implied I didn't think what she was wearing was appropriate. The dishwasher comment had been framed as showing her a more efficient way to load it. Each comment had seemed innocent to me in the moment, but strung together over a year, they formed a pattern of constant correction. I called Greg and told him what happened. He listened to everything and then asked if I really thought I'd only made a few small comments over the past year. I said that's what I remembered, and he said people usually remembered themselves as being better than they actually were. He asked if I'd ever considered that I might be overly critical, and I felt defensive. Greg said he'd noticed it too, actually, and had mentioned it to his wife after we got drinks. He said I had a habit of pointing out flaws or suggesting improvements for everything, from the bar we went to the beer they served, to the traffic route we took home. He said it wasn't mean-spirited, but it was constant, and he could see how living with that would wear someone down. I felt like everyone was ganging up on me and told him I was just trying to be helpful. Greg said that's what critical people always say, and maybe I needed to examine whether my help was actually helpful or just exhausting. He suggested I talk to Olivia's therapist or find my own, because this wasn't something I could logic my way through. I spent the next 3 days alone in the house trying to work and failing to concentrate. Richard emailed asking about the status of several projects, and I realized I'd let things slip while dealing with my personal problems. I stayed up late catching up on work and felt resentful that Olivia's accusations were affecting my career even more than the incidents themselves. On the 4th day, Claire called me. She said Olivia had told her everything, and she wanted to talk to me in person. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop downtown. Claire showed up looking angry and sat down across from me without ordering anything. She asked if I had any idea how miserable I'd made her sister over the past year. I started to defend myself, but she held up her hand. She said she'd watched me criticize Olivia at family dinners, holidays, and casual hangouts. She said I corrected how Olivia told stories, commented on what she ordered at restaurants, and made little jokes at her expense that weren't actually funny. Claire said everyone in their family had noticed it, but they'd kept quiet because Olivia seemed happy otherwise and they didn't want to interfere. She said the chicken comment wasn't the problem. It was just the final straw after 12 months of death by 1,000 cuts. I sat there feeling attacked and said I'd never meant any of it to be hurtful. Claire said intent didn't matter when the impact was making someone feel worthless in their own relationship. She pulled out her phone and showed me a text conversation between her and Olivia from 2 months ago. Olivia had written that she felt like she was never good enough for me and was exhausted from trying to do everything perfectly to avoid criticism. She'd said she was starting to resent coming home because she knew I'd find something to comment on. Claire scrolled up and showed me more messages going back months, all variations on the same theme. Olivia feeling inadequate, anxious, and criticized. I read through them and felt sick because I genuinely hadn't realized I was doing this. Claire put her phone away and said whether the destroyed items were accidents or subconscious sabotage didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that I'd created an environment where my wife felt so undermined that she either stopped caring if my things got ruined or actively didn't care enough to prevent it. She said I needed to figure out if I could change or if I should let Olivia go before I destroyed what was left of her confidence. I drove home feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. I sat in the driveway for an hour trying to process everything Claire had said. I thought about the past year and tried to see it from Olivia's perspective. Every comment I'd thought was helpful could be reframed as criticism. Every suggestion could be seen as implying she wasn't doing things right. Every joke could be taken as mockery. I pulled out my phone and started going through old text messages between me and Olivia. In one exchange from 4 months ago, she'd sent me a photo of a cake she'd baked, and I'd responded by saying it looked good, but the frosting was a little uneven. She'd sent back a neutral acknowledgement. In another exchange, she'd told me about getting a compliment at work, and I'd responded by saying that was nice, and then immediately changed the subject to ask if she'd picked up my dry cleaning. I read through months of these small moments where I'd either criticized her or dismissed her excitement, and each one made me feel worse. That night, I started researching emotional abuse and found articles about criticism being a form of control. I read about how constant small corrections could erode someone's self-esteem and create anxiety. I read about how some people didn't realize they were being emotionally abusive because they framed their behavior as helpful or honest. Every article felt like it was describing me, and I felt nauseated. I'd thought I was a good husband who was honest and helpful. I'd thought Olivia was being oversensitive or possibly sabotaging me. But the more I read, the more I realized I'd been systematically undermining my wife for a year and calling it honesty. The destroyed items weren't revenge or sabotage. They were the natural consequence of someone who'd stopped having the energy to be careful because they were too exhausted from being criticized. I stayed up all night reading and taking notes and trying to understand how I'd become someone who hurt the person they loved without even realizing it. The next morning, I called Olivia and asked if we could talk in person. She said she wasn't ready to come home yet, so I asked if I could come to Claire's house. She agreed and gave me the address. I drove over and found Olivia sitting on Claire's front porch. She looked tired, and I wondered if she'd been sleeping any better than me. I sat down next to her and told her I'd spent the last few days thinking about everything she said. I told her I'd talked to Claire and read her text messages and researched emotional abuse. I said I understood now that I'd been criticizing her constantly and calling it help, and I was horrified by what I'd done. Olivia listened without interrupting, her face neutral. I said I didn't think she'd destroyed my things on purpose, and even if she had, I understood why. I said I'd made our home a place where she felt inadequate and anxious, and that was unforgivable. I told her I wanted to change, and I was willing to do whatever it took to fix this, including therapy and counseling and taking a hard look at my behavior. Olivia was quiet for a long time, and then she said she appreciated me acknowledging the problem, but acknowledgement wasn't the same as change. She said she'd been thinking too, and she'd realized that whether or not the incidents were accidents didn't matter because either way, they were symptoms of a damaged relationship. She said if they were true accidents, it meant she'd become so stressed and anxious living with me that she couldn't function normally. And if they were subconscious sabotage, it meant her mind was trying to protect her from someone who made her feel worthless. Either way, the relationship was broken, and she didn't know if it could be fixed. I felt panic rising in my chest and asked her if she wanted a divorce. Olivia said she didn't know what she wanted yet, but she knew she couldn't come home until things changed. She said she'd been happier at Claire's house in 4 days than she'd been at home in months, and that told her everything she needed to know about the state of our marriage. I asked what I could do, and she said I needed to start therapy and actually work on changing my behavior, not just acknowledging it. She said she'd continue her own therapy, and we could maybe try couples counseling eventually, but she needed me to do the individual work first. I agreed to everything and asked when I could see her again. She said when her therapist thought it was appropriate, not before. I left Claire's house feeling desperate and lost. I'd thought the conversation would end with Olivia coming home, but instead, I was more alone than before. I called 3 therapists that afternoon and found one named Dr. Keating, who had an opening the next week. I took it and spent the days before my appointment working through everything I'd realized. I made a list of every criticism I could remember making to Olivia over the past year. The list got longer and longer, and I felt sicker with each item. How had I not seen what I was doing? How had I thought constant correction was the same as being helpful? I showed up to my first therapy appointment with pages of notes and a desperate need for someone to tell me how to fix this. Dr. Keating was a man in his 50s with glasses and a calm demeanor. He asked me to tell him why I was there, and I spilled everything. The criticism, the destroyed items, Olivia leaving, my realization that I'd been emotionally abusive without knowing it. He listened carefully and took notes. Dr. Keating asked me to describe my childhood and my parents' relationship. I told him my father was an engineer who valued precision and efficiency above everything else. Every family activity was optimized. Every conversation was an opportunity for improvement. Every mistake was a teaching moment. I'd grown up being corrected constantly, and my father had framed it as preparing me for the real world. Dr. Keating asked how that felt, and I said it felt normal, because that's all I'd known. He said that made sense, and I'd learned that love meant helping people improve, because that's what my father had modeled. He asked if I'd ever felt accepted just as I was by my father, and I realized the answer was no. Every accomplishment came with a suggestion for how to do better next time. Every success was met with comments about the next goal. I'd spent my whole childhood chasing my father's approval and never quite getting it. Dr. Keating said I'd replicated that pattern with Olivia, treating her the way my father had treated me, and calling it love because I didn't know any other way. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I'd done to Olivia exactly what my father had done to me, and I'd hated how my father made me feel, but I'd never connected those two things until now. Dr. Keating said recognizing the pattern was the first step, but changing it would take consistent work. He gave me homework to practice noticing when I felt the urge to criticize or correct someone and to pause instead. He said I needed to learn the difference between helpful feedback requested by someone and unsolicited criticism that made me feel useful but made them feel inadequate. We scheduled weekly appointments, and I left feeling like I'd opened a door to understanding myself that I'd kept closed for 32 years. The work was harder than I expected. Every time I noticed the urge to comment on something, I had to stop myself and ask if it was actually helpful or just my need to feel like I was improving things. The urge came up dozens of times a day with everyone, not just Olivia. I caught myself almost criticizing a coworker's presentation, almost commenting on the restaurant Greg chose for lunch, almost suggesting a better route to my mother when she described her commute. Each time I stopped myself and said nothing, it felt physically uncomfortable, like holding my breath. Dr. Keating explained that I'd conditioned myself to feel useful through criticism, so not criticizing felt like not contributing. He said I needed to find new ways to contribute that didn't involve correcting people. I practiced asking questions instead of making statements. Instead of saying someone's idea could be improved, I asked what they hoped to achieve with it. Instead of correcting how someone did something, I asked them to explain their process. The shift felt awkward and false at first, but after a few weeks, it started to feel more natural. I noticed people seemed more relaxed around me. Greg mentioned that I seemed different, less tense. Richard commented that I'd been easier to work with lately. These observations surprised me because I'd thought my criticism had been helpful, but apparently, people preferred interacting with me when I wasn't constantly correcting them. 6 weeks into therapy, Dr. Keating said it was time to address the destroyed items. He asked if I'd considered that my reaction to those incidents had been about control more than the items themselves. I didn't understand what he meant. He explained that I'd felt comfortable in our relationship when I was the one doing the criticizing, but the moment Olivia's actions, whether accidental or not, affected my life negatively, I'd lost that sense of control and felt victimized. He said I'd kept detailed notes about the incidents as if I was building a case against her, which showed I was more interested in proving I was right than understanding what was actually happening in my marriage. The observation made me deeply uncomfortable because it was true. I documented everything so I could show people that Olivia was the problem, not me. I'd wanted validation that I was the victim, and when Greg and Claire and eventually Olivia herself told me I wasn't, I'd felt attacked. Dr. Keating said that was the mindset of someone who needed to be right, more than they needed to be connected, and it was a pattern I needed to break if I wanted to save my marriage. I asked how to do that, and he said I needed to apologize to Olivia without defending myself or explaining my intentions. He said a real apology took full responsibility without making excuses or expecting forgiveness. I thought about all the times I'd apologized to people by saying I was sorry they felt that way, or sorry if they were offended, which weren't actually apologies at all. Dr. Keating gave me homework to write out an apology to Olivia that took full responsibility for the criticism and the environment I'd created. I spent days on it, writing and rewriting, trying to remove every defensive phrase and every explanation that shifted blame. The final version was 3 paragraphs that said, I understood I'd criticized her constantly, made her feel inadequate in her own home, created an environment where she felt anxious and stressed, and I took full responsibility for the damage I'd caused to our relationship. I showed it to Dr. Keating and he said it was good, but I needed to remember that apologizing didn't mean Olivia would forgive me or come back. He said the apology was for her benefit, not mine, and I needed to accept whatever she decided afterward. I sent the apology to Olivia via text because she'd said she wasn't ready to meet in person yet. She didn't respond for 3 days, and I felt anxious wondering if she'd even read it. On the 4th day, she texted back saying she'd received it and was processing it with her therapist. She said she appreciated me taking responsibility, but words weren't enough. She said she needed to see sustained behavioral change before she'd consider coming home. I wrote back saying I understood, and I was committed to continuing therapy and changing my patterns. She said good, and that she'd let me know when she was ready to talk again. The waiting felt excruciating. I wanted to push for a timeline or ask when I could see her, but Dr. Keating had prepared me for this. He said I needed to respect her boundaries and let her control the pace of reconciliation. He said, after a year of me controlling her through criticism, she needed to feel like she had agency in the relationship again. 8 weeks after Olivia left, she texted asking if I'd be willing to do a couples counseling session with her therapist. I immediately said yes. She gave me the address and a time for the following week. I showed up 15 minutes early and sat in my car trying to calm my nerves. Olivia arrived right on time, and we walked into the building together without speaking. Her therapist's name was Dr. Linda Marsh, and she was a woman in her 40s with a warm but professional demeanor. She asked us both to sit down and started by establishing ground rules. Each person would have time to speak without interruption, no raised voices, no personal attacks. She said the goal of this session was to hear each other's perspectives and decide if couples counseling was something we both wanted to pursue. She asked Olivia to start by sharing how she was feeling. Olivia said she'd been thinking a lot about the past year and had realized the criticism wasn't just annoying, it was damaging to her sense of self. She said she'd started questioning everything she did and second-guessing every decision because she assumed I'd find fault with it. She said the destroyed items represented the moment she stopped caring whether she pleased me because she realized she never would. Dr. Marsh asked Olivia if she thought the incidents were intentional or accidental. Olivia said she honestly didn't know because her memory of each incident was hazy. She remembered being distracted and stressed, and things just kept going wrong with my belongings. She said whether it was her subconscious acting out or genuine accidents caused by her mental state didn't matter because either way, the incidents were symptoms of her deteriorating mental health under constant criticism. Dr. Marsh asked me how I felt hearing that. I said I felt horrified that I'd created an environment that made Olivia so stressed she either destroyed things accidentally or subconsciously, and either option made me the villain. I said I'd spent the past 2 months in therapy, learning about how I'd replicated my father's critical parenting style in my marriage, and I was committed to changing. Dr. Marsh asked what that change looked like practically, and I described the homework Dr. Keating had given me, pausing before criticizing, asking questions instead of making corrections, practicing acceptance instead of constant improvement. She nodded and asked Olivia if she'd noticed any change in our limited interactions. Olivia said our text exchanges had been different, less corrective and more neutral. She said it was hard to judge real change from texts, but she appreciated that I'd stopped trying to fix or explain everything. Dr. Marsh asked us both if we wanted to continue couples counseling, and we both said yes. She explained that her role would be to help us rebuild communication and trust, but she couldn't do that work for us. She said she required both partners to be in individual therapy as a prerequisite for couples work because the individual issues needed to be addressed separately. I confirmed I was working with Dr. Keating, and Olivia confirmed she was continuing with her own therapist. Dr. Marsh scheduled us for a session the following week and said our homework was to have one positive interaction before then. Not a deep conversation or a reconciliation attempt, just one moment of genuine connection without criticism or defensiveness. We agreed and left the office together. Olivia asked if I wanted to get coffee, and I said yes, surprised and hopeful. We sat in a coffee shop and had the most normal conversation we'd had in months. We talked about work and her sister and neutral topics that didn't touch on our marriage. I practiced everything I'd learned in therapy, listening without interrupting, asking questions without judgment, accepting her statements without suggesting improvements. At one point, Olivia mentioned she'd tried a new recipe, and it hadn't turned out well, and I felt the automatic urge to ask what went wrong or suggest how to fix it next time. I bit my tongue, and instead said it was brave to try new things even if they didn't work out. Olivia looked at me surprised and said, "Thank you. That was actually nice to hear." We finished our coffee and she said she'd see me at the next counseling session. I drove home feeling like I'd passed some kind of test, but also understanding that this was just the beginning of a very long process. The work I was doing in therapy wasn't about getting Olivia back. It was about becoming someone who didn't damage the people they loved through constant criticism. Over the next 3 months, Olivia and I attended weekly couples counseling sessions while continuing our individual therapy. Dr. Marsh helped us practice new communication patterns and establish boundaries. One boundary Olivia set was that I couldn't offer feedback or criticism about anything unless she specifically asked for it. If she cooked dinner and it wasn't perfect, I needed to either say something genuinely positive or say nothing at all. If she told me about her day, I needed to listen and empathize, not problem solve or suggest how she could have handled things differently. These rules felt restrictive at first, like I was walking on eggshells, but Dr. Keating helped me see that Olivia needed space to rebuild her confidence without my input. He said after a year of my constant corrections, she needed time to trust her own judgment again. The boundary that surprised me most was when Olivia said she wanted me to stop documenting things about our relationship. She said my notes about the destroyed items had felt like I was building a case against her, and she needed to know I wasn't keeping score anymore. I deleted the notes from my phone and committed to approaching our marriage as a partnership instead of a performance review. We started dating again, meeting for coffee or dinner once a week with the understanding that we were rebuilding from scratch. I had to learn who Olivia was without the filter of my criticism, and she had to learn whether she could trust me again. 4 months after she left, Olivia said she was ready to try spending a night at home. She came over on a Saturday and we had dinner together. I'd been terrified I'd slip up and make some comment, but I'd practiced enough that staying quiet felt more natural. Olivia cooked pasta and it was slightly overcooked, and I ate it without saying anything except that I was glad we were having dinner together. She smiled and said she'd noticed I'd bitten my tongue. I admitted I had, and she said she appreciated the effort. We watched a movie, and she stayed overnight in the guest room. The next morning, she made coffee that was too weak, and I drank it and said thank you. She asked if it was okay, and I said it was perfect, because having her there was all that mattered. She cried a little and said this was what she'd needed all along, just to be accepted as she was. Olivia moved back home 2 weeks later, and we continued therapy both individually and together. The destroyed items were never mentioned again because we both understood they were symptoms of a bigger problem that we were working to fix. My career stabilized once I wasn't dealing with constant crises at home. Richard noticed the change and mentioned I seemed more focused and less stressed. I practiced my new communication patterns at work too, and found that my team responded better when I asked for their input instead of correcting their output. 6 months after Olivia moved back, we had a session with Dr. Marsh where she asked us to reflect on how far we'd come. Olivia said she felt like herself again, confident and capable, and our home felt safe instead of critical. I said I'd learned that love wasn't about improving someone, it was about accepting them and supporting their growth on their own terms. Dr. Marsh smiled and said we'd done the hardest work a couple could do, which was admitting the relationship was broken and fixing the root cause instead of the symptoms. 1 year after the chicken comment that started everything, Olivia and I were having dinner at home. She'd made chicken again, and this time it was perfect, moist, and seasoned well. I told her it was delicious, and she said thanks. She'd been practicing. I felt the old urge to ask what she'd done differently, or suggest she make it this way every time, but I let it pass. Instead, I just enjoyed the meal and the fact that we were sitting together, happy and connected. After dinner, we were cleaning up, and Olivia dropped a plate. It shattered on the kitchen floor, and we both froze. I looked at her, and she looked at me, and I could see the fear in her eyes that I'd react badly. I got the broom and dustpan and cleaned it up while she stood there watching. When I finished, I said accidents happen, and it was just a plate. She hugged me and whispered thank you, and I understood she was thanking me for more than just cleaning up broken ceramic. We'd both learned that the real destruction in our marriage hadn't been from ruined jackets or broken plates. It had been from the constant erosion of respect and acceptance. The broken things could be replaced, but broken trust and confidence took years to rebuild. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.